couple weeks ago, I put out a tweet, and I was just sharing about a book I have coming out this fall. It's in the video description. It's called Why God Makes Sense of a World That Doesn't. And in that tweet, or I guess it was one of the tweets in the tweet thread and then in the Facebook post, I just shared a little bit that there's poignant experience behind the book. You know, that through my own, I think I said something like, there's lots of talk of deconstruction these days. I've worked that through in a poignant way, and this book comes from that. And I thought maybe I could just share a little bit about that, kind of how I've walked through, because I watch a lot of YouTube videos about spiritual deconstruction. By the way, I hope the title of this is not clickbaity. To be clear, I'm a Christian. I'm a pastor. Okay, so that's where this is headed. Okay, so my experiences of spiritual deconstruction, if that's the right term, 2 seasons of real doubts and angst and struggle resulted in a stronger faith, and that's kind of just to lay my cards on the table. That's where I'm coming from here, but I also thought, I see this is a huge movement. I see so many stories of spiritual deconstruction right now. Really, it's got me alarmed because narrative and testimony is so powerful. So I'm seeing all these people sharing their stories about how they're deconstructing, and I feel like that gains momentum in so many people. And I don't want people to do that. I want people to deconstruct the things that are bad about their faith. Like feel like I've been through a little bit and probably will always go through, but not their faith itself. And I want to explain a little why of, what my heart is behind that. So I thought, okay, there's so many of these stories on this side out there. Let me share mine. Okay. Even though it's not very dramatic, it's not like it wouldn't make a good movie. It's more just been this, churning thing underneath normal life, just in my thoughts. So this will be a little more vulnerable, probably. I mean, I don't know, not just for the sake of being vulnerable, but just a little more. I'll try to be as honest as I can. But again, it's not real dramatic, but I'll still try to be real honest. And then this video is going to have less structure. Most of my videos, I try to write out some kind of relative outline, but this, I don't know where it's going to go. So it might be a longer video, find some time and sit back and hope it's helpful for people out there. But for me, I would say if I had to identify, like, okay, what have I been through on this? I would say there's been 2 seasons in my life where I've just worked through kind of the classical worry, I guess, just to put it as simply as I can, of what if I'm wrong? Which is, Nietzsche used to talk about, it's not the courage of your convictions, it's the courage to attack your convictions. And I think there's something to that. It's really, really scary to ask the question, what if I'm wrong? If you care, if you really love your faith and what is associated with your faith. And one of those was in college, the other was more recent. And both of them had an intellectual component and then other components. I'd say more recently, there was just this feeling of disillusionment based upon political dynamics in recent years. I'm recording this video in 2021, up until January of this year, and then climactically then. It's been a brutal season for many of us who use the label evangelical and feel that label's been taken up into contexts because of the political environment that are not what we'd want to be associated with. And that has been disillusioning to the extent that it's been hard. I mean, at times I've had thoughts like, gosh, remember Karl Barth, when he's opposing, there's so many churches that are capitulating to Nazism. And so the Barmen Declaration, he and Bonhoeffer and others are opposing Hitler. Well, I'm not trying to make a direct comparison, but there's that same feeling of like, it's deeply confusing when many, many, many Christians make compromises from your vantage point that you don't expect. And it's like, ooh, it just raises questions. And then it's been in combination with so many other things happening in the American church. And this video is not coming from a political angle, but I'm just trying to set the context because, I mean, as recently as the things that came out with Ravi Zacharias, I would have thought of Ravi Zacharias as, like, in my naivety, until recent things. I don't know, maybe I'm being too honest, but I would have thought of him as like a more trustworthy person, whereas other prominent Christian ministers and leaders, you can see, oh wow, look there's a trail of smoke behind him. Obviously there's issues, but then With him, I don't know. I've had a lot of experiences where you get let down by somebody. Somebody lets you down, and you start to be afraid. Oh no, what if I'm becoming cynical? Because the questions that keep coming up are, who's next, and can I trust anybody? Or the cynicism, the fear of cynicism comes in when it's like, is this just shot through American evangelicalism to the point where it's everywhere and it's just the whole thing is just diseased or something like that? I don't know. I mean, these are the kinds of questions. I don't even have answers. These are just the things I'm working through. So there's that side of it, just, having grown up within American evangelicalism and just all those kinds of worries. And then there's the intellectual side where at various points I've kind of just hit something and realized, it's not what I thought. It's not as simple as I thought. The world is more complicated. Truth is more complicated. Issues related to creation and evolution, that's been a big one for me. I've taken a lot of flack for my views on those things. I'm more open to evolution at this point, though I'm not sure. I don't. I'm not a scientist, so the whole thing is I'm trying to be careful, But I'm on record for this so I guess it's safe to say, but I'm more open to evolution at this point. And I've slowly, my arguments for intelligent design have been sort of slowly loosened. They've loosened in their grip on me and on my convictions, because I've just seen, I don't think that actually is necessarily a compelling argument. So I'm still sort of not settled on the details of that issue. And as you're going to find out by the end of this, I'm still absolutely committed not only to theism, but to the integrity of the Genesis creation account, and to, for instance, that there was really a person named Adam and things like that. So, but I know what it's like. So I watched, for example, one of the deconstruction stories that I watched was from Rhett and Link, both of theirs. And I like those guys. I'm not drawing attention to them in a negative way at a personal level or anything. But I was dismayed watching their deconversion stories. Here's where I would describe myself. Rhett, I think his name is Rhett McLaughlin. He's one of those two. I hope I'm pronouncing his last name right. He mentioned evolution as one of the first things for him. This is why I think it's so important that whatever your views are on that, we got to talk about that, okay? But he mentioned that as one of the first dominoes for him. In fact, why don't I pause and I'll show a little video clip of him talking about this.
And so then you think, well, it seems to me that the most logical conclusion is that these two manuals come from a common manual, that there's an ancient common ancestor that is the ancestor to both humans and great apes. And this is what you see. And these are just two small pieces of DNA evidence, and I'm not gonna go into any more details. But let me just say that the main thing that this did for me is I had been told a lot of things about evolution. I had been told things growing up. And now I was questioning those things because I had been told that there's no real evidence. This is a desperate attempt to try to come up with some harebrained theory to just explain things. And I'm like, but this DNA stuff is pretty freaking conclusive. I can't imagine another way to, now I'm not saying there aren't explanations for this. I'm not saying you can't go to a creationist website and find that it's not like they don't know about this. They have an answer. I've read the answer. I find the answer to not be compelling in the least. But let me just say, this made me just question, like, all this stuff, you've been told all this stuff, like I had been told that there were no transitional fossils. There were no transitional forms. There's no transitional between this animal and this animal. Well, it turns out there's a lot of them. There's a lot of very convincing ones. I've been told that there were really no vestigial structures, that there's nothing on your body or an animal's body that's like a sign of something that's no longer being used. There's always a use for it, and we keep finding those use for it. Well, it turns out there's lots of examples of vestigial structures. In fact, there's many structures that there's no other way to properly understand them other than them being vestigial, meaning that they're from the past, they're no longer in use. Essentially, every criticism of evolution that I had held on to justify my unwillingness to believe in it turned out to be a misconception or a misrepresentation of the facts. And so after reading a bunch of books, talking to a lot of people, I didn't want to believe this. I'd spent my whole life not believing this and not wanting to believe this. But I kind of was just faced with this, that evolution was by far the best explanation for what we actually see in the real world.
Rhett keeps going, and from there he talks about, like, I watched this a while back, but I think he talks about like archaeology and the book of Joshua and other concerns about biblical scholarship, and then Bart Ehrman with the Gospels and things like this and other things. My journey has been different. What I've been through, and I don't know if part of this is my personality, I try to be conservative in terms of don't over, because I know that most intellectual errors happen by means of overreaction, or if not most, many. You're over here, you realize that's wrong, so you go zoom all the way to the other side. So much of the way of the world, that's how things go. Well, so I try to not do that. So when I have worked through issues related to creation and evolution, I've tried to take it just one step at a time. And where I differ from where Rhett has gone is, for him, evolution was the first domino for many other points. For me, it was the exact opposite. On other things, so like the integrity of the Gospels as historical resources, that one I've gone in the opposite direction, and I'm in my own, and people can go watch my video responding to Bart Ehrman. I'll put that in the video description. And see, I think Bart Ehrman is wrong. I think he's clever, and he's got a good case, because it's like, yeah, okay, so the material in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that is earliest dated is so different from the Gospel of John. And John has Jesus claiming to be God so clearly. But the fact that Jesus claims to be God differently in the material in the Gospels that's earliest doesn't mean, as Ehrman insists, that he doesn't claim to be God at all. It doesn't. I don't know how to read a book like the Gospel of Mark without seeing this everywhere. It's the constant recurrent theme for Mark chapter 2, and when Jesus forgives the man's sins, and it starts the conflict with the Pharisees, who say, who is this? Who can forgive sins but God alone? They start thinking he's blaspheming. He intercepts their thoughts and claims the authority to forgive sins. Okay, the Son of Man, that's him. That's who he's talking about. And that's all throughout the conflict, all throughout Mark, and then in Mark 14 at his final trial, same thing. He's accused by Caiaphas of blasphemy, and Caiaphas tears his robes, and Jesus responds by quoting Psalm 110 and Daniel 7. He splices those two passages. It's very clear to me that although in Mark Jesus is claiming to be God differently, he's still claiming to be God. He's claiming divine authority that merits this charge of blasphemy. So that's one example of where I don't agree with Bart Ehrman. I'm like, no, I think the Gospels are incredible historical resources for ancient history, and I think the portrait that they yield is consistently of this man who claimed to be God, and therefore the Lord, liar, lunatic, or legend, because we want to add on that category, argument is still on the table. And so in other words, what my spiritual deconstruction has looked like is deconstructing some things, but coming back to the core and finding it stronger and more durable than I ever anticipated. And I passionately believe with all my heart that if people who go through that process kind of take it step by step, they will have a similar experience. For example, and this is where I get into, and this is what led to the apologetics book. I mean, the arguments for the existence of God are really compelling. They make so much sense out of our experience and out of our world. Where did our world come from? It looks like the best thing it looks like, the best explanation, the best summary of the data is that it looks like our universe began to exist about 13 billion years ago. Poof, here it comes from nothing. Now there's minority reports on that, but that's the majority view. It's still kind of the standard, what people call a Hawking-Penrose model, where the origins of the Big Bang, before the Big Bang, there is literally nothing. And I've always known that, but boy, every time I go back to that, that's been like when you're walking up a uneven set of stairs and there's a guardrail, you can put your hand on the guardrail. That's what that argument, the cosmological argument, the idea that God is the best explanation for our universe because everything that begins to exist has a cause. Or I actually like to go away from that argument, what's called the Kalam cosmological argument, and just put it more broadly, because basically you need to say, even if the universe was eternal, we need a first cause. We need something that stops the causal chain. We need some explanation for why contingent things are here. And it makes such sense, and it's as comfortable as putting your feet into your slippers in the morning to assume that necessity is the context in which to understand contingency. And then you get to the argument from design, which has never been my favorite argument. I've always avoided it. But then in the context of my research, I'm realizing, wow, sometimes you can tell the strength of an argument by what the counter arguments are. The best counter argument, and really only primary counter argument on the market to the argument from design, that God is the best explanation for the physical constants that are so highly tuned such that our universe can be life permitting. The best and primary response to that is the multiverse hypothesis. That is, that there's zillions of universes out there and we just happen to be in the right one. And I remember when I discovered that's not really in dispute, that that's the primary response. I'll never forget when I discovered that. I thought, so maybe the idea of a creator God isn't so crazy if that's the alternative. It's like, here's what that did for me. I thought, any way you look at our universe, it's incredibly mysterious. It's incredibly intricate and wonderful. It's incredibly vast beyond our wildest dreams. And it's not explicable in terms of rational observations and science. Nobody, because the multiverse is not observable, nobody can make sense of our reality on the basis of what we can reason and what we can observe, because the multiverse lies beyond those capacities. So it's like, it kind of, the more you get into these, at least here's my experience. I'm not trying to say this as a way to leverage this against others so much, though I do hope it could help someone. But this is mainly narrative and testimonial. What that did for me is to say, the old idea of a creator God, it kind of makes a lot of sense. That the universe started and that it looks really well put together and built. And then you come to the moral argument. And here is where, I've always followed William Lane Craig and these other great apologists who talk about the objectivity of moral values and duties is best explained by God and this kind of thing. But what really struck me as I did my research for my book is how devastating practically and psychologically and culturally the alternative is. And I don't mean that atheists are like that. I think atheists are often wonderful people, and my theology would lead me to expect that because of the idea of creation in God's image. And so I don't mean this in any way for people who hold the worldview, but the worldview itself. And I think the older atheists, and people can watch my video on this, I think the older atheists like Nietzsche and Sartre and people like that saw that pretty clearly and pretty well and expressed it with admirable courage. That when you don't have a supranatural standard, everything does come down to evolution. And the evolutionary mechanisms that determine animal behavior are a reductive explanation for human behavior and thought. So it all comes back to that, survival of the fittest. And in such a worldview, I don't see how. It's not just the strong devour the weak, period. And that's the some explanation for reality and particularly biological reality. So I find the moral argument to be very powerful because of what it means at a practical level as well as its logical force. I find it to be the only pathway forward with hope and dignity. And, if you value things like individual human rights, that we shouldn't kill off the elderly. It's hard in a strictly naturalistic worldview to see why that's right. I'm not saying that people who hold to that worldview will do that. I'm just saying the rationale, in other words, the ontological basis for morality itself is really hard on a naturalistic worldview. So those are just some of the things that I've gotten to where it's like, okay, here's where I'm at. I'm going through this process. I'm seeing, this feeling of the ground is less firm beneath my feet in terms of the landscape of American evangelicalism and in terms of some of the beliefs that I have grown up with and I've kind of had to, outgrow over the years. But then at the same time, as I keep working at it, I'm seeing that the core of my faith, the idea that God makes a ton of sense, the idea that there does seem to be an individual who was the most famous and influential human being of all time, the largest religion is founded in his name, and the most diverse religion, and he's a pretty astonishing person. And he does seem to have claimed to be divine, and there's a limited number of explanations for that. I haven't even gotten into the resurrection. That's another thing. I've been pretty impressed at the logical argument to be made for the resurrection of Christ, or the historical argument, I should say, is surprisingly compelling. And then I'm looking at I'm looking at all these things, and I'm saying, the core idea that God exists and that Jesus is it's plausible to see Jesus as a revelation of him makes a lot of sense. And then I'll say one other thing, and this is at the very end of it. At the existential level, I mean, I don't even know whether I should use the word doubts for what I've been through. It's more angst, because it kind of comes and goes, and it's this low-grade, constant angst, and I don't know the best way to describe it, because it seems to coexist simultaneous with this kind of experiential certainty. I don't understand the psychology of faith. It's complicated. But at that existential level, I have just found that, how do I put this that doesn't sound really cheesy, but that prayer works, in those moments of desperation, and when you're afraid because you're thinking, geez, what if I'm wrong about this, so what if I'm wrong about that too? That question. I don't know how to explain it, except to say that I just feel that God's been faithful to me in my life. I've seen him come through for me again and again, and I've even experienced him to kind of guide me through these thought processes. So I want to say, in terms of any advice I have for anybody else who's out there, I assume that tons and tons of people watching YouTube videos are kind of in this place themselves, of kind of agonizing through these things. And I want to say I feel your pain, because these struggles are really tough. Unless you've been through it, no one can understand how dark and painful and confusing that pathway is unless you've been down it. If you really love God, and then you're questioning and you're wondering, is my brain playing tricks on me? That's a tough path to walk. So I feel your pain out there. But I would just say a couple things. Try not to be all or nothing. Try not to do the overreact. Deconstruct what needs to be deconstructed. Every good faith will be constantly deconstructing, but then reconstructing. So don't do it as an all or nothing thing. Try to make distinctions between the bad things that need to go and the good things that need to remain. I suspect you'll find, as I found, that the core needs to remain, because there's a lot of good reasons for it. I would also say, if there's one piece of advice I could give to you, it's find helpful community. We all need to process these decisions with other people. So find somebody to talk to, but find a helpful community. And so I would say the two kinds of people I'd avoid. One would be religious people who don't have any context for doubt. They just think faith is easy. There's a lot of people like that, and I don't even judge them for that. Maybe that's just the way they're wired or something like that. Some of us are more analytical, and so it's not necessarily wrong, but they're probably not going to be able to help you. And they might be like a Job's comforter. They just won't get what you're going through. But also, on the other hand, I would avoid the angry, militant deconstructionist types. I've told people, there's times to just stop listening to those deconstruction stories, if they're not given in good faith, especially. Find somebody who's rooting for you to succeed, but also will be sympathetic in the process. And then the last thing I'd say as a piece of advice is just, in the deepest place of your heart, there's a battle going on. Okay? And if you in that place will trust and keep pushing forward toward the light and put your trust in God, he will meet you there. I promise you that. I don't know how to explain that. I just have experienced it. So there it is. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thanks for watching this. If you made it all the way to the end, I'm going to do more videos in apologetic stuff. I'm going to have one coming out on Lawrence Krauss and his definitions of the word nothing, when he talks about what does he mean when he says a universe from nothing. That's my next apologetics video coming out soon. So if you like this, subscribe and you can get notified as other things come out. Thanks for watching. It's vulnerable to share my story. I know what it's like for those other folks when they've done it, but it's a joy to do so, because it gives me a chance to give testimony to the faithfulness of God. May God bless you.